Okay, so in this video, we're going to look at how to make a flame grill floor trap like from Fortnite. Now, before we begin, I just want to set expectation that this is all about functionality. So the trap itself is just going to be a flat block, and instead of having a husk, I'm just going to have an orb. The reason for this is because the actual object itself has no bearing on the functionality. This is about how to trigger the functionality. This is how to have a trap that will, when something passes over it, will trigger a fire effect. And the object that's passing over it will then receive a damage over time. So you're really looking at the triggering as well as the tracking of that damage over time. So again, my apologies, I'm not going to have like a husk and a really great looking trap. It's just going to be using primitive 3D objects because it's all about the functionality. It's all about that trigger. So let's begin. So let's go ahead and click on Game Object, 3D Object, and we're going to click on Cube. So what we're going to do is we're just going to flatten out this cube. So when you have your cube selected, over here in the inspector, you'll see in the transform component, the position, the rotation, and the scale. By default, the vertical, that is the y-axis. So let's drop that down to 0.1. Just want to point out a couple of things. By default, it already has a box collider. So when you create a 3D object, it already has a collider. So we're not going to have to add that collider for the actual shape of the trap. We will add another one, which I'll explain when we get to it. But for now, it comes with its own box collider. So as far as the physical collision, you already have that in place. So let's go ahead and rename that. Just click on that a couple times. And we'll call this grill. Now, the second thing we're going to do is we're going to have what's going to be the enemy that has to pass over it. Again, we're not using a 3D model that's walking around. We're just going to use a primitive. So game object, 3D object, and we'll just use a sphere. Now, it doesn't need to be that big. We want it to be smaller. So again, with the object selected, you're looking at the inspector, the transform. We're going to scale this down to, say, 0.3, 0.3, and 0.3. That way it's still an orb. And then we just grab that y-axis and we'll move it up a little bit. And then we will grab the x-axis and push it off to the side a little bit. And now that we've moved that, what we're going to do is we're going to rename it. So click on sphere a couple times, and we'll change this to husk. So what's going to happen is we're going to have the object move in this direction. When it gets over the grill, we're going to have fire appear, and then we're going to have a DOT applied to the enemy. So a couple things, we need this to be moving. So we're not going to do any fancy AI. Again, that will also have no bearing on this particular functionality because we're just looking to see when the object passes over the grill, how to trigger the fire. So in your game, the object will probably have some kind of pathing. This is just going to be adding velocity along the x-axis. So let's go ahead and do that. So right-click down in the asset area, create C#, and we'll call this husk move. Actually, let's call it husk con for control. Click on the husk. We'll put the script onto it, and then we'll open up that script. Okay, so the double / is a remark statement, which means this does not get executed. It's purely for documentation. I'm going to get rid of that as well as this. If this is your first time seeing a C# script, basically it's just telling you that this gets executed when the object is instantiated, and this gets executed once per frame. So what do we want to do? When it starts, we're going to add velocity. Or when it updates, we could reinforce the velocity. 6 one way, 1/2 dozen the other. As long as it's moving is really all we care about for now. So we could move it if this doesn't work out as we want. So get component, rigid body, and we're going to look at velocity equals new vector 3. And it's the X, Y, and Z axis again. So it's moving along the X axis. So let's just give it like a 3. And then 0 along Y because we don't want it moving along the Y. And 0 for Z because we don't want it moving along Z. And then you just add a semicolon at the end. Save that. Minimize that. Now when we go to our husk, which is just a sphere, as we said. So in the inspector, we're looking at the components. We have a transform component, we have the mesh renderer, the collider, and the script. So I just made a reference to a rigid body, but there is no rigid body. So let's go ahead and add that. So add component, and we go to physics, and there is rigid body. And the only change we're really going to make to this is we're going to get rid of gravity, because otherwise we'll be pulled down vertically, and we don't want that. And this, we can leave the other there. We don't have to change the angular drag or anything like that, or the mass. So let's just run this to make sure that this is moving along in this direction. So this is the camera you're looking at of. So we're actually looking at this from a really bad angle. This is just the default angle. So if you want, you can rotate this around. You can grab the hand. When I'm zooming in and out like that, that's the scroll wheel. Rotating is right click and hold, left. And now, by doing this, our view is a little bit closer to what the camera is seeing. And you can test it by just clicking on main camera, and you can see that this is similar to this. We're just in front of the camera, so it's not quite the same. And now that I mentioned that, let's go ahead and move the camera. So let's zoom back a little bit using the scroll wheel. And we're going to grab that. Oops, sorry, that is the wrong one. I could see it was moving vertically. So let's rotate this a little bit so it's easier to grab the right one. There we go. So we want the blue arrow. That's the Z axis. We'll get right up close to that so it's easy to see what's going on. All right, now let's go ahead and run it. So the only change, other than moving the camera, we added the script onto this object so that it should move in a positive direction. And there we go. A little bit fast, so let's just go back, change that down to 1, save it. I just like there to be enough time to see what's happening before the collision occurs. Perfect. Okay, so we have our grill, we have our husk. The husk is moving. So now what we want is we want the grill to detect that the husk is moving over it. Now, for a lot of times when you have an event, you may not realize it, but there's actually a couple ways to go about the detection. You can either have the husk detecting that it's crossing over the grill. You can have the grill detect that the husk is crossing over it. In this case, we need to do both because we're having something happen to the husk and we're having something happen to the grill. So it works out that both are responding and checking for that event. Sometimes you don't have to do that. In this case, we do. If the trap wasn't changing, then you probably wouldn't have to do any kind of detection. But we do need the trap to do something. Okay, so what do we want to do? So to make the detection easier, what we're going to do is we're going to add a tag to these objects. Now, because we only have one object, you could argue, well, you could just use object name. You absolutely could. But say you have 20 different types of traps and 20 different types of enemies, you don't really want to have to check for all those different names. You really want to use a tag. Not to mention that when an object gets instantiated, something we probably won't cover in this tutorial, its name changes. It wouldn't be grill, it'd be grill, and then parenthesis, clone, and then parenthesis. So the name actually gets changed. So if you're checking for the name, you have to adjust for that. Tag doesn't change when object gets instantiated. So again, because we're only using two objects, it doesn't seem like we need to. And since the objects are already created, they're not instantiating, but it's a good practice. So how do we give a tag? So that's also done in the inspector. So our husk, up here in the inspector, you can see it says untagged. So we want to create add tag. Tags list is empty. Got to click on the plus sign, and we'll call this husk. Now, what you might do is, the idea is that a tag creates a category, among other things. So just as it avoids the naming issue when it's instantiated, say you have 10 different enemies. Well, if they all have the same response, or should all be treated the same way, you could just use one tag for those 10 different types of enemies. So for now, the name and the tag will be the same. So husk. So we go back to our husk. That just creates the tag, so be careful. Just because you created a tag hasn't applied it, you now have to go back and select husk. Same for this. We'll click on our grill, add tag. You can see husk is already there. And we'll call this fire grill or fire trap. And save it. Again, go back to your object and select that tag. Now what we need to do is we need to add a fire effect, because when the grill gets passed over, a fire appears. So we're going to do a very simple particle system. So we're going to go to Game Object. You're going to go to Effect, and we're going to go to Particle System. Change this right away, and we'll call this Flame. And if you want, you can do something like SYS to remind yourself that's a particle system, or PS. You don't have to, but when you start seeing some of these names popping up in the script, it's easier to differentiate what you're looking at. So we'll call that FlameSys, and we'll make a few changes. We don't need the particles to be this large, and we certainly don't need them to go up that far. So let's make the start lifetime like 1 second. And the start speed, we'll drop that down to 2. And this, I'm just totally winging this. This isn't any, I don't want to say there's not any rhyme or reason, but it's like sculpting. You're basically playing it by ear. So let's go to emission and increase the amount of emissions. And keep in mind, when you increase the amount of emissions, be very careful, because if this, okay, the amount of emissions you have and the amount of time they stay on the screen, if it exceeds this, the max particles, then you'll get a gap. So for instance, this is right over time of 10, okay, and it lasts for 1. So if we drop this down to 5, it exceeds it, and it's hard to tell, but there are indeed breaks. It doesn't exceed that 5 particles at a time. So just keep that in mind if you're going to have a lot of particles lasting a long time. So let's increase that rate to, say, 50. Now we're going to zoom in to try to line this up. So this is at 0, 0. Our flame, let's move it 0, 0, 0. And we'll probably raise it a little bit so it's just over the particle system. Now, right now, it is using a cone shape because that's the default shape. So if we come down here to shape and we click on this, sure enough, it's a cone. There's a couple things you can do. If you want to keep the cone, if you want to turn it more into a cylinder, you can just grab the corners and turn this into a cylinder. So like if I click that and I go like that, it's now a cylinder, so it's not going out. That the top is the same diameter as the bottom. We can now shrink in the bottom by grabbing the point there. And it looks like that our particle is still kind of big. We might like that, but it might be a little bit too big. And again, purely arbitrary, purely what you think looks right to you. Got a lot of flicker in here, so we kind of want these things to disappear by shrinking. So come down to size of a lifetime, and you have to put a check there for it to take an effect. Click on the graph, and we've got some defaults. We're going to start with this one. So it starts at full size, gets smaller, and already looks kind of better. But we probably don't want it to shrink too quickly. So if you just right-click, you can add a key. And now you can just like move this key over here if you want it to shrink at the last second. Move it over here. So this is the duration. Left to right is the duration. So not perfect, but like I said, this is we're just trying to make a quick particle system because, again, it's about the effect. So a couple more things, then we'll be all set with the particle system. So color. For one thing, it's white. Let's go to color. You can either do a start color or you can do a color over time. So click next to color over lifetime. Click on the color. We have two different grids going on here. From left to right is the color over time. From left to right up here is transparency over time. So you actually might want to make this more transparent. So you click on the little marker, and then you click here, and you choose the color. We'll just choose reddest red. 25500. That's as red as you can get. And then say we want it to become orange. So we click on that dot, and then you choose like an orange color. Or maybe you want the reverse. Maybe you want to start as orange and go red, whatever looks right to you. Okay, not extraordinary, but I think that is usable. And again, like I said, the intent with this project isn't to have like awesome graphics. That's not at all the point. The point is about the functionality. So let's raise this up a little bit because it is cutting through the trap a little bit. Okay. All right, so that's going to be our flame. Again, you could spend a lot of time on this, make it look much more realistic. For one thing, it's using a circle particle. You could create something that looks more like a leaf or more like an S. That way you could add rotation and things like that. But again, I'll only do that if you guys want to see more of this. Now let's move the fire sys onto the grill, making the fire sys a child to the grill. And the reason for that is right now, even though they're lined up on the screen, they are not connected. So if I was to move the grill, the fire doesn't move with it, which is bad because you're going to want to be able to place a grill and then have a fire associated with it. So right now they're just lined up, they're not actually connected. So just grab fire sys, drag it onto grill. We'll fix that in a second. And now when you move the grill, the fire sys does indeed move with it. So let's go to flame sys, and to fix that, you just need to come to the flame sys, the particle system component, and for scaling mode, set it to hierarchical. Now, even though we don't want the fire to be burning right along, we'll leave it like that for the moment because I want to keep focusing on the husk. So right now we have the husk moving in a horizontal direction along the x-axis. What we want is we want the husk to be able to detect that it is colliding with the trap. Now technically it's not colliding with the trap, it's colliding over the trap. So as I mentioned, the trap itself does have a box collider to give the trap itself solid, give it make it so things can't just pass through it. What we're going to do is we're going to create a second collider just above it, and that is what the husk is going to pass through. And if it passes through that, it will get damaged. So you can indeed have multiple colliders. So we have the grill selected. We click on Add Component. We go to Physics. We go to Box Collider. Now this one is going to be a trigger. And what we're going to do is we're going to move its position. So if we change its center vertically, because like I said, y-axis is up. Let's change it by like 0.2. Let's change it by a full 1. There we go. Now we can see it move. So actually, I realized why 0.2 didn't work, because these units are equal to the size of the object. So whatever the size of the object is, this is 1 unit. So like for instance, if I did sorry, I'm at the wrong one. If I do 2, it's now 2 units above it. So it's not a coincidence the box collider matches the size of the object. So since I want it to be exactly above it, it'll be 1. I just moved the center up 1. We can keep all the other parameters the same. Now, if it turns out you don't want things triggering it just by going over the corner, you can certainly change the size a little bit. Like you could do like 0.9, so you can see it pulled it in, and you can do 0.9 over the Z. That's all up to you to decide what kind of sensitivity you want, but we'll leave it as 1, 1, 1. So now what we want is we want the orb to pass through this, which it should. So let's check its height. Let's move this over here. And now let's go back to our grill. And it looks like a collision is not happening, not even close. So let's take our husk. You can either make the collider bigger, or in this purpose, for this purpose, we can make the husk lower. Yeah, it's colliding with it, but you know, rather than nitpicking, let's just bump the vertical. Let's make the size 2. So now the orb, the husk, is definitely colliding with it. So we already added a tag to the grill. So now it's just a matter of kind of connecting the dots. So the husk is going to detect that it has collided with an object called object with a tag of fire grill. So let's go back to the script for our husk, and we're going to put in private. Then we have to say what type of variable it is. So it's going to be a float, and it's going to be enemy HP, and we'll set its default value to 100. Now, in a fully fledged game, you're probably going to want to add an additional variable that tracks that the enemy is being afflicted by fire. Why? Because in games like Fortnite and other games like that if an enemy has one affliction on it, another effect could occur. So like for instance, in there's numerous things that get triggered when an enemy has an affliction status in Fortnite. Like for instance, there's like a greater chance of getting a critical hit against it. So you may want to track it. I won't do it here because it's a little bit outside of what we're doing, but I certainly can do an additional video if you want to see it, and that is you would add a variable and manage the fact that it's on fire. So it's not just doing the damage, it's tracking the fact that it has damage in case any other attacks interact with the fire. Okay, so we created the variable to say how much HP the enemy has. Outside of start, outside of update, we're going to add a check for the collision with the trigger. So if you recall, there's two collider boxes on the trap. One is meant to be for the shape of the trap itself, to give it, to make it solid. And then you have a second collider above it, which is really the collision zone that we care about, and that is the enemy would pass through that collision zone. When we created it, remember, we set it as a trigger. The reason why I'm pointing that out is because the verbiage is specific to that. So outside of start, outside of update, void on trigger enter. And this is one of the nice things about MonoDevelop, about Microsoft Visual Studio compared to MonoDevelop. MonoDevelop wouldn't give you these to the best of my knowledge, so you could actually make a typo. So I'm really happy that Unity's actually using Microsoft Visual Studio now, because for whatever reason, MonoDevelop wouldn't give you the pop-up when you were doing Ontriggerenter. So Ontriggerenter. And it populates an awful lot for you. So first of all, it says you're looking for the an entry into a trigger zone, and that the collider is going to be named other. Okay. So this is saying, has a collision occurred? That's it. That's all the coding you have to do to check for the collision. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if other, and it's important to realize that's this. It's not a coincidence. That is that. So if other.tag, because if you recall we tagged it, equals quote, and I believe it was it flame grill? Let's double check. Fire grill. Does have to be exactly right. So if the other has a tag of fire grill, squiggly boxes there, actually there has to be a double equal sign, or else Unity gets confused and thinks you're trying to change the value. So when you're doing an if like this, you have to use a double equal sign so it doesn't think that you're changing tag to fire grill. So if other.tag is equal to fire grill, we want something to happen. We want a routine to be created, to be executed. Problem is that routine does not exist yet. So we're going to jump ahead, and again, outside of start, outside of update, outside of Ontriggerenter, we're going to do IEnumerator, and we're going to have a name, and we're going to just call this on fire, in parentheses, squiggly brackets. And what we're going to do is we're going to have, this is where the actual fire is going to do damage to the enemy. So we're going to say, let's start with, so yield, return, new. Don't worry too much about that. Just know you have to use them. What you really care about is the next command. Wait 4 seconds. So this is really what you're doing. You're saying you want to wait before something gets executed. And since it's a decimal, drop in the letter F, or else it gets confused. And now we just take that enemy HP and we subtract from it. So enemy HP minus equals 10. Looks weird, but you're saying whatever this is currently equal to minus 10 from it. So enemy HP minus equals 10. So take its current value minus 10 from it. And now we just want to rinse and repeat. We'll say it gives 3 ticks. So there you go. And what you would do is, like I said, if you have another variable that simply tracks if the enemy or the object is afflicted by fire, this is where you'd set that variable back to no. So you would set it to like yes, either here or in here, because this is when the collision occurs, and then you set it back to no. Again, I'm not going to go through the details because that's kind of outside of what we're looking to do. So now that we have our coroutine, we can actually type this out. So start coroutine, parenthesis, on fire. See how it's there? It wouldn't have been there because it didn't exist at first. So that's why I had to kind of jump ahead. You kind of had to code out of order. We'll save that. So quick look, but I think this should do it. So the enemy now has HP. That's the velocity that it starts with. If it collides with another object, if that object, first of all, it has to be a trigger. If that object has a tag of fire grill, and it does, well, at least the one that's going to collide with, then start this coroutine. This coroutine says, wait half a second, then minus 10 from this variable, and again, and again. Now, here's the thing. How do we know it's working? Well, we need the HP to be displayed on the screen, so let's just put in a debug here. Debug.log, and I strongly recommend that you do debug right along, that way you can know for certain something is working. So basically, you're having the enemy HP be put into the debug log after each change. I believe that should do it. Debug log is down here. There you go. Okay, so not quite complete. There's a few things we need to do, but this video I think has gone on a little bit while, so I'll pause here because that gives you the core functionality. The object has HP. When it collides with the trap, that HP gets reduced over a period of time, and that's a fixed period of time. That's why I mentioned about the update section. This happens every frame, so you really don't want to change variables in here if you can avoid it, because if you have a faster frame rate, then that means those variables are changing faster. By doing this, you decouple it from the frame rate. You're saying after half a second has passed, then do it. Sometimes you'll hear about games where there's not many, but someone's running a really powerful PC, and for some reason they're taking double damage. It's because the designers didn't do their job right, and that they put the damage calculation in the update section rather than tying it to an actual passive time. Not trying to run anyone down, it happens. And it's not that very common, but we've seen that a few times now. Okay, so what's going to happen is in the next video, we're going to look at having a fire effect beyond this. We might just copy this one and shrink it and then apply it to the husk. And also, we don't want the grill to be on fire all the time. We want the fire to be triggered once the grill is passed over. So, all right, so that should do it for now. And if you have any questions, just let me know.